In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 9, in which we go over AD shocks, where in our last video we went over how investment, government spending, and net exports alter aggregate demand. Where now that we've considered all four components of aggregate demand, in this video we seek to consider shocks to aggregate demand by considering some preliminaries in order to go over our AD shocks. We're beginning with our preliminaries. To better understand the results in our AD-AS model, we have been turning our attention to our internal market forces in the form of, first, aggregate demand in order to study demand-side theory, where we know that with respect to aggregate demand, that we can turn to our identity in terms of real output expenditures is equal to the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net export expenditures, where by isolating each of these four components of aggregate demand and examining how they're comprised, we can see that if there's a change in one of these components, how will it affect aggregate demand through a left or rightward shift in the AD curve, where with respect to consumption, we derived the consumption function, which was equal to autonomous consumption plus income-dependent consumption. With respect to investment, we derived the investment function, which was equal to autonomous investment minus the interest rate. With respect to government spending, we took this as a given in our model, or exogenous, in that the government can alter its own spending behavior, and it will be a topic of discussion when we develop fiscal policy. And lastly, we had net exports, which is the difference between exports and imports, where for simplicity, we're currently taking this as a single line item, and we're basing it off of the performance of domestic and foreign economies until we go into more trade-based discussions. With that said, through the latter, we can determine how a shock will affect aggregate demand based off of what expenditure account is affected, as well as what component of that expenditure account. Where once again, a shock is just going to be an unexpected event that alters internal market forces, where such examples of shocks will be natural disasters, pandemics, wars, technological changes, and things of this nature. Where looking at our expenditure accounts and their components, we first have consumption, which is comprised of expectations on income and employment, wealth, credit, and taxes, where items 1 through 4 in regards to consumption make up autonomous consumption, that is, consumption independent of income, and we can think about this in terms of household necessities on goods and services, where if items 1 through 4 change, this then leads to a change in autonomous consumption, which will then shift the consumption function up or down, leading to a change in consumption. With consumption changing, holding all other factors equal, this then leads to a change in aggregate demand corresponding to a left or rightward shift of the AD curve. And then lastly, we also have income that determines consumption. This will comprise income-dependent consumption. It's the independent variable of our consumption function. If there's a change in income, this corresponds to movement along the consumption function. With movement along the consumption function, consumption is changing, and then same argument. There will be a change in aggregate demand, holding all other factors equal, such that a left or rightward shift will occur. Moving on to investment. In regards to investment function, we saw that it was determined by expectations of sales, technology, as well as innovations, where items 1 through 3 will make up autonomous investment, where this is investment regardless of the interest rate. Should items 1 through 3 change, then autonomous investment will change, corresponding to a left or rightward shift of the investment function. Should the investment function shift, then investment changes. With a change in investment holding all other factors equal, this then leads to a change in aggregate demand through a left or rightward shift of the AD curve. And then lastly, we have the interest rates, which is the independent variable of our investment function, or the dependent variable of our inverse investment function. Should there be a change in the interest rate, this then corresponds to movement along the investment or inverse investment function, which will then lead to a change in investment, holding all other factors equal, a change in aggregate demand, thus a left or rightward shift of the AD curve. Moving on to government spending, we took this as a given in our model, or that it was exogenous, where if there was an increase in government spending, this then increases aggregate demand, holding all other factors equal, such that there's a rightward shift, and vice versa for a decrease. This would lead to a leftward shift in aggregate demand. And then lastly, we had net exports, where this was the difference between exports and imports. We're taking this as a single line item, and currently for simplicity, we're just considering foreign and domestic economy performance, particularly with that of the average price level. If the foreign economy has a high average price level compared to the domestic economy, then this incentivizes the foreign economy to purchase more domestic goods, which would lead to a change in net exports. Likewise, if the domestic economy has a higher average price level corresponding to the foreign economy's average price level, this then incentivizes the domestic economy to purchase more foreign goods, which would also have a change in net exports. Where with a change in net exports, this then corresponds to a change in aggregate demand through a left or rightward shift of the AD curve. So with all that in mind, thus for our ADAS model, we can currently look at a story in the form of, if the aggregate product market is in equilibrium and some shock to aggregate demand occurs, our internal market forces will adjust to the shock such that the aggregate product market will adjust to a new equilibrium state, from which we can assess changes to this new equilibrium state by comparing the real output level and the average price level, assess if unemployment is a problem or inflation is a problem, as well as are we in a short-run equilibrium now or a long-run equilibrium. So with that in mind, let us consider two examples in which we seek to examine this storytelling. So in our first example, we have an aggregate product market that is in a long-run equilibrium. So we have our ADAS model below, average price level on the vertical axis, real output level on the horizontal axis, downward sloping aggregate demand, upward sloping aggregate supply. Intersection of the two gives us macro equilibrium, and since we're at the real output level, capital Y sub F, designating potential output, and we're at the average price level, capital P sub F, or targeted average price level, this equilibrium state corresponds to a long-run equilibrium in that full employment is achieved. And when we turn our attention to our simple business cycle graph above, real GDP on the vertical, time on the horizontal, our upward sloping constant long-run growth trend in blue, our short-run cyclical component of real GDP in orange for business cycles. Where this long-run equilibrium will be at, we could think about this at being at the intersection of the cyclical component and the growth component of real GDP. So then after we're at this state, the news begins running pessimistic stories about employment, and they repeat these news stories. And what this does, it has the effect of altering consumer expectations on employment, and it worsens them. Where if consumer expectations on employment changes, this then has the effect of altering our consumption expenditure account, and we know that in regards to our consumption function, this is going to alter autonomous consumption since there's going to be a change in consumer expectations on employment. So then we would expect a decline in autonomous consumption, or with the decline in autonomous consumption, this then leads to a downward shift of the consumption function. With a downward shift of the consumption function, consumption declines, such that holding all other factors equal, that is investment, government spending, and net exports the same, we would expect a decline in aggregate demand. Where with a decline in aggregate demand, this will be a leftward shift of the AD curve. So then turning to our ADAS model, these pessimistic news stories alters consumer expectations for the worse. So then we shift from AD to AD1 in purple, holding the average price level constant. And then we have an adjustment period in which we move downward along the AD1 curve until we reach the new intersection of AD1 and aggregate supply, which we arrive at the new equilibrium state of capital Y star and capital P star in terms of our real output and average price level. Where in regards to this shift from AD to AD1 and movement along the AD1 curve, we can think about this in terms of going from that intersection between our growth trend and the cyclical component of real GDP, and that contractionary period in which we go down towards the trough, where the intersection of AD1 and aggregate supply, this new short-run equilibrium, we can think of this as being as the trough of the contraction that we're experiencing. Where now assessing what's going on in terms of our original equilibrium and our new equilibrium state, we see that capital Y star is strictly less than potential output, so unemployment is going to be a problem. We also see that our targeted average price level is strictly greater than our new average price level capital P star, so there's also going to be deflation going on in this economy. Since our unemployment goal is not met, in terms of being at the lowest rate of unemployment, cyclical employment exists, our full employment goal is not achieved. So in terms of classifying this equilibrium, unemployment is going to be a key issue, and we're in a short-run equilibrium state since full employment is not satisfied. So then, recapping what we saw in this example, an aggregate product market was in a long-run equilibrium state in that we supported our goal of full employment, lowest rate of unemployment compatible with price stability. Then there was a negative shock to aggregate demand that led to the aggregate product market going to a short-run equilibrium state in which it does not support full employment in that unemployment was going on in the form of cyclical unemployment, which we saw evident in comparing our new real output level Y star to potential output capital Y sub F, in which we saw it was negative, where this negative gap in output we can define as the recessionary gap. And we also observed that deflation existed given that our new average price level was strictly less than our targeted average price level capital P sub F. Now, moving on to our second example, same thing, we have an aggregate product market that is in a long-run equilibrium state. Intersection of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, capital Y sub F is our real output level, capital P sub F is our average price level that we're targeting. We're at the intersection of the long-run growth trend as well as the cyclical component of real GDP. But now in the story, say that a natural disaster occurs in a foreign economy. This is likely going to change aggregate supply, and when this foreign economy adjusts to their new equilibrium state, we would expect that in the short run they will have declined real output level and an increased average price level, where with this increase in the average price level, say that it's higher than the domestic average price level. This then incentivizes the consumers and firms in the foreign economy to purchase more domestic goods and services from the domestic economy due to its lower average price level. So then, foreign economy begins importing more domestic goods, such that net exports in the domestic economy rises. With an increase in net exports, holding all other factors equal, this corresponds to an increase in aggregate demand, which we'll see through a rightward shift of the AD curve. So then, through this negative shock occurring in the foreign economy, corresponding to a positive shock in the domestic economy, we go from AD to 81, holding the average price level fixed, and then we have an adjustment period to a new short-run equilibrium state, in which we're going to be at the real output level Y star and at the average price level capital P star, where with this increase in aggregate demand and new short-run equilibrium state, we'll see that inflation will be a problem. We see that capital Y star is strictly larger than our potential output capital Y sub F, so unemployment is not going to be a concern, but when we look at our new average price level P star, we see that it's strictly larger than our targeted average price level P sub F, so inflation will be a problem, which can be evident due to the foreign economy putting strain on our domestic economy, which results in demand pull inflation. So in our example, what we had was an aggregate product market that was in a long-run equilibrium that supported full employment. In this case, there was a negative shock to a foreign economy corresponding to a positive demand shock in our aggregate product market for the domestic economy. This resulted in demand pull inflation such that when we adjusted to a new short-run equilibrium, we did not support full employment, and there was inflation given that our average price level P star was strictly larger than our targeted average price level, and unemployment was not that much of a concern since capital Y star was strictly larger than potential output, where this positive gap in output is what defines the inflationary gap. Or keep in mind through these examples, they are just simplified states of the business cycle, in that we just considered being at a long-run equilibrium, the intersection of the growth trend and the cyclical component, and moving down towards a contraction to the trough of a contraction, or going from a long-run equilibrium, having an expansion occurring, and then being at the peak of an expansion. But if we recall what actual business cycles look like, there's not such a clear-cut pattern in terms of long-run equilibrium to short-run equilibrium and vice versa, in that they're not so predictable. And what we overall saw is that through our two examples, we have seen that a demand shock can lead to an aggregate product market going to an equilibrium, where the short-run equilibrium is not desirable due to the problem of unemployment or inflation. So then this leads us to the question of how we can return back to a long-run equilibrium then, where this will depend on the stability of business cycles and what policy tools we can use, and this will be the topic of our next chapter.